Why don't you start giving that countdown in Latin instead of make it interesting? It was funny, folks. He tried to do it. A man asked an oracle, "Why cannot those who have seen the truth about life describe it?" "It's too simple," came the reply. And since he was last in line and the temple was then closed for the day, the man was left to take this brief response home with him to ponder. And he did so. For hours, for days, for months, and then decided he wanted his money back. Or at least his original question, back intact. One man had a drifter who came to live in his house. A lad asked his dad, "When I grow up, can I be distracted?" "As opposed to what?" he replied. There was once a wise man who walked the aisles of a train, attempting to help those passengers whom he could. One man one day awoke to realize that the wise man had been walking the aisles of his own mind. A fortune teller once said to a man, "I can tell you that your fortunes will never increase if you are mistaken in your identification of those who are wise." And the man forever wondered whether the seeker meant those externally or those within us all. Today's Bunko Bulletin. No one can swindle and bamboozle a man like he can himself. This is how the collective world of man, based on mental operations, can continue to thrive and grow. There was once a man on a train who got wise and decided that a wise thing to do might be to get off. I regret that I have but one jump to give to me. Man is the only being who can be in two places at the same time. Rack up another point for man. Man is the only being who can be in two places at the same time. A few do not find this automatically to be a positive attribute. Man is the sole creature with the capacity to find fault with his nature, which is automatic. A man asked an enchanter, "I have heard it claimed that we are not who we think we are. Could this be so?" "I don't know who you think you are," was the reply. The meaningful distinction between distraction and control is that there are no limits to the number of possible distractions. Score update. The general flow, 2,496. Us, our attention, 27. And that's just today, thus far. That supreme paradoxical conversation. There is but one thing standing between you and a great discovery, the mind. But is not the great discovery also the mind? Yes, and there you are. A speaker in front of a crowd said, "If anyone is actually here, please stand up." There was once a man who had two sons. One was cross-eyed and the other wall-eyed. So he smooshed them together and made one boy who turned out to be the sort who was always looking where no one else did. I assume by now that you recognize what sort of person this is without me always having to identify them by name. Fact, category important. Subheading, potentially too simple to be immediately found operational. Anything you think about yourself is incorrect. Conclusion. In light of this information, anyone with a brain larger than a flea's would quit thinking about themselves. A boy asked his father, "Is irony just absurdity taken seriously?" "Yes," he replied, "and them both but cover words for stupidity." "And how ironic and absurd," mused the lad. More mental health news. If you're of ordinary mind, you're a schizophrenic. If you're still the self you were born with, you both approve and disapprove of what you are, but don't know why. And I will tell you Your disapproval comes from the unknown fact that there are possibilities within you of another self besides the one life issued you. So, as long as you remain where you are, partially in the internal dark, you will stay a schizophrenic, of ordinary mind, of two minds, in conflict. But hey, 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 Dr. Jackal, that's what keeps the collective world a-turning. One man for years held formidable conversations with himself until he discovered it was not really himself he was talking to. The mind of man is the only function that can be everywhere at the same time. Score update. The mind, 600 billion trillion 4,000 and whatever else there is. The body, 3. But God, what a 3. That means either think about it or you've got a flea on your head. A man asked a seer, "Do we live in a strange part of the universe?" "I don't know where you live," was the reply. There was once a man held prisoner in his own house. A boy asked his father, "I read it said that those who can't do it talk about it. Is that true?" "Not totally," he replied. "Everyone who can't do it talks about it, which includes everyone alive. Most talk about it without knowing that they do, which is the difference between them and the few who know that they do." On a long journey, all the passengers will discuss the destination. Either that or blankly stare out the window. On a long journey, all the passengers will discuss the destination. The most useful ones will be based on some awareness of the undertaking and not mere fanciful daydreams. From one view, the approach we have been taking is like trying to still the mind through sitting and meditating while not sitting and meditating. One man swallowed a distracting machine, which got lodged in his head. Thank God it didn't get any lower, where it could have done some real damage. There was once a man who began to think of himself as being me number 1 and me number 2, to try and distinguish between the two. Small problem. If he did not constantly remember this, me number 1 would totally overwhelm, engulf, and make disappear number 2. One man awoke one morning to suddenly discover that he was himself. It took him 30 years to suddenly discover this. One man found an animal that sometimes hung around his house. He decided that he wanted it to come in and live, but no matter what he tried, he could not find a way to make it do so. So, he tried not trying to. And all of you rational people in the audience had best stop up your ears about here while I go on to tell you that. That approach, if not worked, at least worked a lot better than the original one. By Yemeni. Maybe you got to read that one. One day, one man found drugs under his bed. Next day, things got even worse. He discovered his head under there. Finding the natural sexual attraction of east to west makes it inevitable that the twain will always meet. Juvenile version of said finding. Aromas will track down perfume no matter where it is hiding. A man asked a mystical luminary, "Why do men keep insisting that if it's not one thing, it's another?" To which the brilliant one replied, "Because it is, you chowderhead." Moral, keep your big mouth shut, you chowderheads. One man had a disease which caused one part of him to age faster than others. There are two ways you can exist. You can exist while being aware that you do, and you can exist without taking personal notice thereof. Someone on the platform just called out the departure of another train. Was it yours? The ruler of one kingdom one day announced that henceforth all talk would be considered perjury. And a mighty hush fell over the land. at least among those who knew what was good for them. A man asked a philosopher, "How may I know what is good for me?" "Get out of here, are you nuts or something?" was the reply. One man had a package he wanted to get rid of, but every time he mailed it away, it'd come back to him. So, here's what he did. He finally mailed it away, but without telling it that he had. When you're freed from the absurd gravitational hold of logic, it's truly surprising the number of amazing and profitable things you can do. A man asked a pundit, "Where did humanity get the idea that 2 plus 2 must always be 4? "Before what?" asked the puzzled pundit. "See, I told you." With hand on stomach, a man consulted a physician. "I either have an ulcer, have pulled a muscle, or else unknowingly in my sleep have swallowed a mathematician." And the doctor responded, "Well, let me ask you this. Up in your head, what do you feel going on?" And the man moved his hand from his ab to his nog, was quiet for a moment, then replied, "I'm thinking in there." "Oh," on the physician. And the man quickly asked, "Is it worse than you feared?" And the doctor replied, "Oh, it's even worse than that. You're an ordinary, everyday type of guy. Now get the hell out of here so I can see some real sickos." The moral to this story being so childishly obvious that even I won't stoop so low as to note it. One man used to stand and watch the trains run by his house. He watched until he began to stare, and then they began to run through him. There are 2 types of metaphors, meaningful ones and bullshit ones. That is, merely entertaining literary ones. And the operational distinction being, the baloney ones are always referred to man's life in general, while the useful ones point specifically to man's mental world singularly. And if you're not already a handler of the latter variety, then this distinction itself is bullshit. A man asked a savant, "When did humans first begin to deal in allegories and symbolism?" "When did humans begin to speak?" he replied. There are 2 ways you can look at a sunset. You can look at a sunset as a sunset or as a basis for a nice oil painting. And those out actively in the effort know that nothing can replace the hands-on approach. And they further discover that where life normally leads one to believe that where hands should be laid is not necessarily the area of most promise and benefit for the individual. Hence, among other reasons, the operational need for a time for descriptions of things in a way that does not attempt to literally track their outline as mundanely represented by life. Look away, and beyond the symbols and thoughts and words is that which gives birth to thoughts and words. Is that beyond or behind? A man so began to address an audience. "The mind is like," and suddenly every mind in the crowd shouted back, "Don't tell us anymore what the mind is like, damn it all to hell." A man asked a mystical priest, "How can I tell for certain if I am actively engaged in the effort to reel in the general flow of thought and establish my own individual consciousness?" To which the magical one replied, "Too easy. If you're mentally grappling or worried about anything," and the man interrupted him, "Anything? Will you shut the hell up and let me finish," said the mystic. On a faraway world once lived a curious creature, curious in that it could swallow itself. Legend says that it migrated from there to other planets, planets in need of growth stimulants. A man asked a wizard, "From where does man's ability to think come from?" "Come in," cried the wizard, "the door is open." Legend says that the supreme growth stimulant on some worlds is willful self-consumption. And suddenly the little voices of billions and billions of minds were heard pleading, "Oh no, let us out of here." The truth about life is simple. What men think about it is complex and filled with meaningless details. A man said to a soothsayer, "I want to find myself." I didn't know you were lost, he replied. And the man thought, out of all the seers, sages, and magicians in the world, I had to pick a comedian. The mind, a final word. The mind which men feel is prepared to act is not the one to be used by those aspiring to mental things extraordinaire. In an area down the road from here, the idea of mental activity that is spontaneous and unplanned is seen as both the rebellion against life's general flow that is necessary for the few, but also as a proper pushing on the present limits of man's collective thinking. A father asked his son, "Are you at home or back in the drift of thought?" A man asked the wonder in the mirror, "Where have you been all my life?" Drift away, the loss of vision, the root of distraction, the hiding away of one's other possible self. And our final question of the hour. If you're not here, then where are you? Beyond a struggle for daily subsistence, which is where anyone who would ever hear this would be, and it would be such people who would only have an interest in such things. Beyond that, we have then men with free time. And no matter what it is called, how do they seek to fulfill that time? And it's called by many things that men would say that they're seeking some sort of personal satisfaction in life. They're seeking peace. They're seeking fulfillment. It all amounts to one thing. It amounts to them saying that they want to know the meaning of being alive. And we will note again, we all know that the routine flow of humanity, routine men do not walk around using such terms as want to know the meaning of life. But that, I repeat, all activity in which the mind is engaged above the struggle for subsistence, which excludes everyone hearing me, that everyone hearing me has free time. If they didn't have free time, they wouldn't be listening to this. If they were starving to death and faced with having to go out and beat the bushes for some bushes to eat, they were caveman vegetarians probably. Or beat the bushes for something to eat, for something that was hiding in the bushes. Hopefully not your cousin or uncle. Although men do not use as a rule in such terms as that they're seeking to know the meaning of being alive. Anything that the mind is engaged with, all the way from extremely puny such pursuits to those that apparently are aimed right at the target, they are seeking to know the meaning of what it is to be a human and be here alive. If you look at it, perhaps the puniest would be most forms of popular entertainment. As always, this is not an artistic critique of popular entertainment of any sort. But you could pick out that which would perhaps at first blush seem to be far removed from anything having to do with the question of the nature of life and of existence. But it is not. The mind has no other choice. If you think about horror movies, slasher movies, just B-grade movies, pulp fiction, cheap fiction of all kinds, just the normal things that people, without taking any particular notice, will turn their attention to, let it drag them along for a period of time, whether it be reading or watching it flickering on a screen somewhere, and it can appear to be absolutely mindless trash, just mindless recreational pastime. But it's still, well, I want you to see, it's not that hard to see, the mind has no choice. If we suddenly tried to take it down to a human level and pictured writers bunkered up in a cheap motel room in Burbank, and somebody's come up with enough money for a film, and they said, listen, we've only got X amount of money, and it's going to run, if there are any drive-ins left, but it'll run, it's going to open as a B-grade movie, as they used to call them. And they're saying, don't send us any messages. You know, we're not Western Union. We're not trying to impress we're trying to turn a few bucks. So get in there and turn out something. And here's a list of all the B-grade movies that made a profit last year. You know, come up with some new version, combine a man with a chainsaw who's a mad rapist and hates his mother and the government. You know, come up with whatever is popular. Here's the point. They can sit down, which people do. Now, that's what they do to try to write any kind of popular. If they're really trying to hit for the bottom line, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what they're attempting to do. No matter how they attempt, if they sit there and start writing and drinking a little coffee and taking pills or having a few slugs, and somebody starts coming up, well, here, I think I'll have the mad dog killer. He'll stop, they'll pass an old folks home, and we'll see a flashback in his head of his mother and how much he loved her. Another guy goes, that's a waste of time. Those people don't care about that. No, skip all that. In other words, they try their best to make it mindless with no message, almost no redeeming social qualities, as they used to call it. It's not possible. It's not possible. The movie, since it came from a human brain, a human mind, the movie will still be addressing the question of what is it to be alive. No matter what you try, it's just a matter of meaningless degrees in there. To ordinary minds, it's meaningful degrees, because to ordinary minds, and ordinary views, as it should be, of course, there is quite a bit of difference between a cheap paperback novel or a mindless B-grade blood and gore movie than there would be a film version of Hamlet, or the works of Kant. They say there's a great deal of difference. And we can all see why they say that. But they have this in common. They all are an expression of the mind's desire to know what life is about, what it means to be alive. And we can admit, I just want to make sure you get the point, we can admit that in some people, this drive is turned to the lowest possible level. That the flame is very weak in many people on this planet. But what I want you to understand is, there is no other choice. If the mind is operating and talking, and as I said, even creating that which other people would ponder, seek out, all the way from movies to books to philosophy to religion. It is all the same. There is no possibility. The only thing that would apparently be a small exception, if I may point out again, we've done it on numerous occasions in other ways, the only thing that might appear to be an exception would be the mind involved with very specific technological areas. But once you see what that's involved with, all technology is the mind's direct working. It's the mind's first job is working for the body. Technology, all that is the mind working for the body to ease up the struggle for subsistence, so that the mind can then have time not to deal in technology, not to deal in concerns about staying alive with the body, which it's got to. And the body's its host. The mind doesn't think about that, but the mind has no choice. The mind first works. The first thing men did was, for instance, making it sort of cartoonish, was invent the wheel. They did not invent philosophy. They did not invent art. They did not invent movies. They invented the wheel. Then they invented the lever. Then they invented the electric lever. That's the way it goes. And then they had enough time, they sat down and went, phew. And then somebody said, I've been waxing philosophically. And everybody went, hey, why not? And they invented chess, and they invented word games, and then they invented movies. They invented art. They invented civilization. But what I want you to see, think about it. You can see it yourself. Get past technology. That is a given. That is the first thing that the mind does. I can't see that it should be any great secret. But after that, everything else that the mind does that is not, you can look at yourself, that whatever it is the mind's doing, if it is not directly, just easily observably connected to survival, which movies are not. You do not need movies, for instance. You do not need fiction. You do not need literature, period, for the body to survive. So anything beyond that, they all have one thing in common, whether it be cheap fiction, whether it be supposed deep theological, philosophical thought. they all have this in common. It is the mind seeking to know what it is to be alive, what it is to be a human and be alive. That's it. Now I would like to divide up what happens with humanity besides the wide gradual spectrum that I tried to describe, all the way from kinds of cheap, mindless fiction to so-called significant, important literary works, philosophical works, and then to the soft sciences even, psychology, philosophy, sociology. For our sake, I'm going to cut up into two kinds of knowledge all these attempts, that they amount to, let me rephrase that, not just the ones I've spoken of. Let me divide up all the mind's ability, every possibility it has to ponder, to investigate this question of what does it mean to be alive? Why am I here? One more time, and I'll try to not do it. People do not walk around, I know, only philosophers. And damn few of them do. They just read that some philosopher did it and they think they should. But people do not walk around on the tips of their frontal lobes with the question continually hanging about what is the meaning of being alive. But what I'm telling you is, no matter what they call it, they have no choice. That is what the mind is doing. It doesn't matter what your mind is. It doesn't matter where your mind grew up, what sex it is, what culture it is. That is the nature of the mind. Once the body can live and the mind is not having to stand there and aid the body in staying alive right then, that in some way the body is not assisting and making easier survival, then it's like the mind is on coffee break. It's like the mind is, you got your own free time. And then it starts inventing things that are not of necessity or not of survival necessity. And all of these things, and if I left out any of your favorites, fill them in. But every other aspect, in fact that includes every aspect of civilization in the sense I use it, is then a reaction. It is the mind seeking the meaning, seeking to answer what does it mean to be alive. That's why do men make up stories? Nobody ever asks that. Why do people write fiction? Why do people make up any sort of tale? And don't say to make $1. That's not it. What drives the mind to make up stories? What drives the man, a man it might seem easier in philosophy and religion, and to say, well, what drives a man to be a philosopher? It might be easier at first, you would think, to say, well, that is someone trying to ponder such questions as what is it to be alive. Not such questions. It's the question. As soon as the body is more or less fixed, survival is almost a given. After that, it's not questions. There is only one interest the mind has. Everything springs from it, and that is the mind wondering. Well, you could think of it as being yourself if you want to be magnanimous about it. But it is the mind wondering, what am I doing here? What is this? What does it mean to be alive? What I was going to ask was, nobody even asked such questions as this, but what is the basis? What drives somebody to make up a story? The very first story, whatever it was. Why did somebody make up a story? Why did Cain or Abel or somebody come back to Eve and say, hey, when I was out in the woods today, let me tell you what happened. And he makes up this story. And his mother knows it's a story. The first person who ever heard the first story knew it was a story, or the first storyteller said, hey, I made up a story. And nobody ever asked. And the person said, wait a minute. What do you mean you made up a story? And they went, well, I just thought of something that's never happened. Think about the byplay that could go through if minds were actually as inquisitive and as potentially objective as men claim they are. The first storyteller. Don't get confused with Cain and Abel, I just threw that in. The first storyteller comes back to the first person he had, the first listener, and says, hey, I made up a story. Let me tell it to you. All right, the first potential listener would say, well, what's the story? And they go, well, I thought about something that never happened between some people. Well, how would you think that? Oh, well, listen, I don't know, I thought it. And I thought of this story. And it's something that's never happened. It's never happened to me, but I dreamed it, and I think you'll find it interesting. Whatever it took, the first storyteller got the first potential listener to finally sit still and listen, And obviously the first listener found some enjoyment therein, or else we would not have it. My question to you, and I'm not going to answer it, but consider, why does nobody even ask, why do we like fiction? Why do you like it now? Why will you go pick up and read a short story or go read a piece of fiction? Why will you go see a movie? Why will you turn on a TV show? What is it? And I'm talking now not just specifically the effect it has on brain waves. I'm trying to take it a little above the level that's too close to too close to putting me out of business. Actually, too close to putting you out of business, but see, that's what we're trying to do indirectly. You can't walk right up to the door of an average person, to their mind, and knock on the door, and them say, well, hello, and you go, are you open for business? They go, yeah, why? And you go, what do you want? What are you selling? You go, I'm here to put you out of business. And of course, any sane, reasonable mind on this planet will immediately throw open the doors and welcome you and apologize for not having some snacks and perhaps a band there. Right too. What is it that you like about fiction? Think about it right quick. I'm going to get off this rhetorical question. When I say you, the mind. Why does the mind want to see a fictionalized account of something? Why? Of course, there's not really much difference between that and why do people like history or gossip. That is, the people like stories that are non-fictional. As if they know the difference. As if it makes a difference. Or, for those of you in senior class, as if it makes any difference. It still is all coming from the same place. Once you see that, then all these questions about what's the difference in high art, low art, good art, bad art, fiction, non-fiction, soft science, a little harder science, statistically based science, soft science, social sciences. What's good art, what's bad art. It's all the same. There's one answer. It's all the same thing. It is the mind, without having any choice, it's the mind trying to answer the question, what does it mean to be alive? Well, I was going to divide not just the ordinary, but the potential for the mind. Now, what I'm going to describe, I was going to describe two possible kinds of knowledge available to the mind. Info, ways to look at things. That is, the search for the answer. What does it mean to be alive? So we'll assume that the search is supposed to result in some knowledge, some information, some discovery of a mental nature. And I'll be dividing it up, and one of them will be, at least theoretically, unknown to ordinary people by the way I'm going to describe it. But that does not mean that an ordinary person, if they actually listen to what I'm about to say, could not follow the verbal distinction that I'm drawing. It's sort of like me describing a place that you've never been, and we both know it, but then I can describe where you are now. I can describe the furthest reaches to which you have traveled in such a way that it can almost form a negative outline of what's beyond that. No particular spatial names. I'm just going to use ordinary names. That I could call it that there would be a great knowledge and a small knowledge. I could call it conditional knowledge and non-conditional. Or I could call it local knowledge and non-local or universal knowledge. And it would all be referring to the same thing that I can describe, as I said, the first one. The first one is every knowledge, which is every opinion, every theory, every piece of fiction, every fable, every myth, every religion, every philosophy, everything, every piece of information that the mind has ever thought before that is known to your mind is what I'm calling the first group. It is local, it is small knowledge, it is conditional knowledge, and there is an absolute way to identify it. Small knowledge, local knowledge, always talks about itself. The other kind does not. We got a few seconds. Everyone go into pondering mode, and here we go. Or for those, perhaps of you of a more poetic bent, go into your musing mode. Okay. There is more here than me trying to play with words, as always, for those of you that would like to see something. Think about all common knowledge. Again, forget technology. All common knowledge. Think about all religious thought. Think about all philosophical thought. Think about all political thought. Think about all the ideas from philosophy, psychology, sociology. Think about it. They all talk about themselves. When you're dealing, as I said, one name I could have also given to what I was calling small knowledge is conditional knowledge. It talks about itself because it cannot come to a conclusion. Now, I've said this many times and just point out to you that psychiatry, for instance, cannot succeed by its own definition. Religion can't succeed. Peniology, social reform, eradication of fleas on domestic animals. Take your best shot. The ordinary institutions, which are manifestations of the mind in its search for what is the meaning for being alive, what I'm referring to now is small, local, conditional knowledge. It's all the same thing. Being unable to come to a conclusion, it is not possible, then it continually talks about itself. And if I were going to try and turn it into a psychological observation, which was not the intent, but I'm going to do it in this sense that perhaps you'll get a glimpse. If I was doing this from an ordinary psychological view and was capable of seeing this much and still talk about it, I would say that such things as psychology, for instance, talks about itself based upon the fact that it cannot come to a conclusion and never can. And not because of psychology, it's not to follow psychology, it's the nature of the mind at the small level. It can never come to a conclusion. Thus, psychology, religion, everything else, think about it. If, without it knowing it, that the mind, a particular mind, some sets of mind, some groups of mind, undertake religion as their field. And the mind itself, not the people, but the mind, having, you could say, a mechanical, an inert, but a mechanical, a basic knowledge, an unspoken knowledge of its own workings, it knows it will never reach a conclusion. I know that doesn't make sense, but think about it this way. If a meat grinder could think, it would know that it was never going to pick up your favorite radio station. It would not ever try. The mind, in a sense, knows that it's not going to come to a conclusion. Thus, can you see, if I was using a psychological description, what I was set this up as, you could look at talking about yourself as being a kind of attempted justification. Well, we can hope. You can see that. All right, what do people do? What do people do when they have failed, when they have come up short and what they were going to do? Just ordinary, everyday people. You don't even notice it. It is so common. If you promise someone that you would do such and such favor for them, and then they call you up and go, you took care of that, and you go, oh my God, because you didn't, you forgot. What do you do immediately? You talk about yourself. Immediately. Which to talk about yourself at the ordinary level is to simply say the mind is talking about itself. Because that's all you are when you talk about yourself. That is the basis of it. What is the first thing you do? Is what I meant by a kind of psychological justification, an explanation of one's self, of one's behavior, of one's failings, is what I'm getting at. In the same way, all small knowledge, all local knowledge, which I assume you see is all normal human knowledge, it is always inconclusive, always will be, but a certain aspect of it that people never take note of is that it always talks about itself. Now, if you will look at what you think of, an ordinary person think of as being themselves, and after all my suggestions and hints, I will assume that at least allegorically, momentarily, you can see that a man's normal self is almost how about almost? I'll give you room. Is almost synonymous with his mind. People do not analyze it, I know, and they will say, well, I am myself, and you can look at it one way and say, well, people are more concerned still in this day and time about their body, that there are more in shopping centers, there are more weight loss clinics than there are walk-in philosophers' offices. That there are more people trying to lose weight than there are trying to increase their consciousness. There are more people trying to lose weight than there are trying to increase their IQ. There are more people trying to lose weight than there are trying to increase their ability to speak whatever language they speak. I know all that. And yet a person's, if they did not have a mind, since I saw that up, this is always the dagger to an ordinary mind's heart. If a man did not have a mind, he would never, ever try to lose weight, a man or a woman. That's the kind of thing I assume lots of people, if they hadn't turned me off already, that picked this show up, they thought, well, that's enough of that crap. You know? Because it's like you went, because there's no way out. And they just, the mind normally just won't even deal with it. It'll just, with the great power of the mind, least you underestimate, it will suddenly make this man's hand just inadvertently grab the remote and go, and I'm yesterday's news. I'm out of here. Anytime you find an exception that seems to be, and I figured you'd like weight loss, that it seems to be that I say that the mind, after the level of struggle for survival, that after that the mind is total engagement, or almost, it's up to how much of a backbone you got, is engaged with trying to wrestle with the question of what does it mean to be alive. But then I just point out myself, I did it for you before your mind could, that wait a minute, then how do you explain the fact that here, the most civilized country, the most educated, blah, 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 that the national fascination is not with answering the question, what is the meaning of life? It's, I got to lose some weight. It does seem that way, except for this. If you didn't have a mind, no one, there's no exceptions to this, it's just no one would ever try to lose weight. It would never cross their mind. It would never arise. It is it's non-existent. There is no such thing. You work on that. Those of you that still have the station on. Back to, if you look at the self as being the mind, it is synonymous. And that should be, that sort of thing right there. I can keep coming up with examples. I understand how subtle it is, and I'm sure that most of you do by now, because your mind can almost see, or your hearing, if I'm talking about, let's say, for instance, not because of my great speaking abilities, but if it's being presented in a certain way and you're listening, I know you can get glimpses for a while. It's like shadows jumping in and out of the room that, what I think of as myself is really my mind. It's really not any more than that. And the mind can immediately, the realization is just so fleeting because the mind immediately itself can come up with things like, wait a minute, myself is not just my mind, it's my body, because I worry about my body more than I do my mind anyway, so there you are. And then you and your mind both go, well, you kind of put your arms around each other and say, hey, you got it. Because it's obviously not true, because the mind says, well, it's not true. Look at what you think about. You worry more about your gut hanging over, or you worry about more you've been spitting up blood or coughing too much, or that you might have a hernia or something. You worry about that when you do your mind. You don't worry about the meaning of life. You worry about trying to stay alive. You worry about you're about to die of something. You go, that's true. Click, I'm out of there. The whole idea is out of there. But anyway, to those who see it, it's obvious as hell. And I know it's hard to hold in the mind. But a man's sense, what he calls himself, if you can't, I'll put it another way, if you can't see, which I understand how hard it is, verbally, in fact, it is, verbally, it doesn't, as we say in the philosophy business, smoosh. to say that your sense of self and your mind are synonymous, you think, well, you must mean something. Put it back to you another way. If you didn't have a mind, you've got no self. And again, that's when it feels like you went, oh, and the mind goes, turn that crap off. Or else your mind goes, I mean, it's obvious as hell. If you don't have a mind, you don't have a self. So if you don't like calling the mind and the self synonymous, then so be it. But that doesn't change the fact that if you didn't have a mind, you wouldn't have a self. Quick, turn on new Jello wrestling. If you can see then, this is where I'm building up. Small knowledge, let's start it this way. Make it appear to have some logical sequence here. All right, some sequence. How about that? We can go that far. I started out pointing out that the mind, everyone's mind, of course by that I always mean just sane ordinary people, by sane ordinary people's definition. Ordinary people's mind, after survival is seen to, which puts everyone who ever hears this in that category, that the mind, without any possible exception, with no choice, that everything it does after that is, to varying degrees, an attempt to deal with the question. That's what the mind is there for, is what are we here for? Why am I alive? What is the meaning of this? Then, once you see that everything the mind does after that is to that end, is based upon that interest, is driven by that hunger to know that. That is the nature of the mind, that's it. Once you see that, then I just divided up the knowledge that the mind could gain. And by knowledge I was including all theories, opinions, guesses, just the ramblings of the human mind, but normally called knowledge. That is, thoughts that people have, including opinions and everything, and proven suppositions, but knowledge, ideas. I'm saying that there are two kinds, there are two classes. One is, I was calling conditional, local, small, but local covers it if you know how I use that term, and it's conditional. That is all the knowledge that the mind normally has available. And it has one distinct characteristic. It always talks about itself, and I just tried to describe to you from one view why it must, or why it keeps resorting to it. It cannot go from A to B when B is a conclusion. The mind cannot get to the destination, which is to say the mind by itself cannot answer the question, what does it mean to be alive? Because to begin with, you could not ask the question, what does it mean to be alive, if you did not have the mind to ask it. It does not have the answer. Therefore, not having an answer is the same way as somebody asking why you failed to do what you said you would, and you immediately talk about yourself. Religion continues to talk about itself over and over. Look at it. Not just religion, but everything. Religion. Somebody, I don't guess a big deal, counted the words of Jesus. Pick Christianity. I forget the actual recorded, the official recorded accepted words of Jesus. I can't remember. Does anybody know? 100, 200? There's some little teeny amount. But every year, the Christian publishing houses, I mean, my God, it'd fill up the city of, probably Waukegan. All the streets and empty lots of just the books written on Christianity. I mean, you know how it is. They just continue to churn them out. And why? It's based upon one man's words, one man's life, but it's his words. And it was what it was, 200. And now there are 20 trillion billion books about that. And I don't bring that out to be sarcastic. Philosophy is the same way, but theirs just came to mind, was a great example. The mind has no choice, though, because it cannot take what Jesus' words said. It can't take anybody's words and go to the destination. And so it continues to have to talk about itself. Psychology does, psychiatry it does, everything in man's civilized world, to say his mental world, has to talk about itself to stay alive. It's cannibalism. There is no choice. It can't go where it said it's going, so it has to keep talking about itself. My alleged sequence, we went from there to me pointing out that now, look at the mind also as being synonymous with oneself. Whenever people say myself. And I tried to now take what we have now fully understood. I knew there'd be no questions. And to see that what I've said about knowledge and the mind, that you can see that there are, well, when I said all ordinary knowledge is small, conditional, and inconclusive, then I am, of course, also saying that there's another kind. And you can at least see it by negative inference, that it would not talk about itself. It does not have to talk about itself. It would be based upon the singular distinction I am drawing tonight, that small knowledge, local knowledge, always talks about itself. Then non-local knowledge, which would be the kinds of things that's known as transcendental knowledge, or the kinds of things that people realize through the so-called enlightenment, the awakening of the brain shifting into some other condition, some other operational mode, that would be knowledge, if we're going to call it that. That would be knowledge that you gain some way, things that you now know that do not talk about themselves. Then I tried to take you from there to consider now your very sense of yourself. When people just think about themselves or say myself, or I'll tell you what I believe, I'll tell you the kind of person I am. It is based upon that same small knowledge. Or, if we can jump real quick then, you can divide up all sense of oneself. When I start saying that the human mind, everyone, once they're fed and they're past the point of having to struggle for daily survival, that they seek, whatever they call it after that, some satisfaction out of life, some lingering or some permanent pleasure, some personal fulfillment. They oftentimes also throw in that thing about, well, I want to be free. I would like to be myself in some way. I like to, is usually what they mean by personal fulfillment, that I want to discover what it is in me that I have yet to uncover, what it is in me that's still trapped like a young burgeoning songbird who is yet to fully realize its tuneful destiny. I want to liberate it. All right? So, people want to be, as I said, another way to even look at the kind of things, activities such as this. Well, everybody's trying to be themselves. That's what the mind is doing when it says that, when I put it, that it's trying to wrestle with the question, what does it mean to be alive? Another way to put it is that people are trying to be their real self. Where we start out, now I want to divide up instead of knowledge and minds, that there are small minds and great minds, or local minds and non-local minds, the same as local knowledge and non-local knowledge. There would be, I'm now suggesting, two possible types of self, a small self and a non-small self. Of course, I'm tempted to say great self, but I don't mean in the sense that you're a better person and that suddenly you have joined up some secret club with the gods, but it's that there's your small self is the self you're born with. Everybody's born with it. And it has this distinction. I start out about knowledge. It carries that same distinction with it. The small self, the local self, the self with which life that you were born, the self life issued you, that self talks about itself. That is not the road to understanding what it means to be alive. And yet that's the very thing that the local self, the self, when people say they won't be themselves, a common cry, what they're saying is that they do not want to be the self they are now. And I will suggest to you, they would never come to this conclusion, that the reason they do not like the self that they are is that it is conditional, it is inconclusive, and it is left with talking about itself. And it's easy, in a sense, for me to point out that people, all they do is talk about themselves. Now, it takes no great effort. And I would also further suggest to you that people, as common a hobby, as much time as it takes out of a person's verbal life, people yet are subtly frustrated by it. It sounds otherwise, and I've even made it sound otherwise, that if you listen to people talk, about all they do is talk about, well, I, blah, 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 I, blah, blah, blah. And yet people are not really satisfied by it. They do not find an alternative because the mind, which is doing the talking for them, cannot find the meaning of life or what it means to be alive. And in the same way that I point out that the mind will do it, so too do people do it, that they will revert to. It is just, no one thinks about it. They will begin to talk about themselves. And that is not the way to discover yourself. I guess for the third time, we stab the mind right in the heart, and it goes, if you cannot get your mind off of mental things, you're a goner. You can live out your days and everything else, but you'll never understand anything. You'll never even come close to understanding. You'll never come close to any kind of view, insight yourself of what it is, what it means to be alive, if you cannot get your mind off of mental things. The very mental things that we have spent the last 45 minutes talking about. Or if I may end by quoting a father there at the end to his son. He said, "Are you at home? Are you back in the drift of the mind?"